Here's a recapitulation of my journey towards metaphysical idealism. I began to have serious doubts about materialist metaphysics around 2023, just after a trio of physicists, John Clauser, Anton Teilinger, and Alan Aspère, won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics for proving local realism to be false. It's a wonderful tale in the annals of physics involving the testing of Bell's theorem and the falsification of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox paper. This fascinating story goes back to the late 60s up until now. The experiments for correlation for multiple particle pairs tested by John Clauser and co. exceed Bell's limit, proving that there are no hidden variables and that reality is weird. Local realism is false. It was a team effort that started with Clauser coming across Bell's paper in 1967, where Bell proffered a theorem with hidden variables to salvage local realism. Clauser was the first to write to him, asking if it had been tested. Bell said Clauser was the first to contact him about it. Decades of effort finally disproved Bell's inequalities. In essence, these brilliant physicists disproved the conclusion arrived at by Einstein and co. as a solution to the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, an early critique levelled against quantum mechanics. They thought quantum theory's description of reality had to be incomplete and that there are missing hidden variables. As it turns out, there are none. One can only wonder what Einstein would think today. In addition, Aspère subscribes to idealism. His journey preceding the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics is an interesting one too. He was visiting universities looking for an interesting topic for his PhD after dabbling in optics and holography. He would eventually be invited to America to a seminar that would elucidate him on the state of quantum physics at the time. He had been given a file containing Bell's paper, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper, and two theses by Friedman and Holt. It was Bell's theorem that caught his attention the most because it proved von Neumann's reasons for rejecting hidden variables to be wrong, and von Neumann was considered to be one of the most intelligent people on the planet. Bell's limit was important because it helped to determine whether local realism was false or not once the trio conducted the photonic experiments that followed. It is already quite remarkable the things that have taken place since last year up until now. There is even some reasoning for cosmic pluralism. Space has been measured to be flat or stretched in all directions, and Hubble's law shows it expands at superluminal velocity. This means that space appears to be infinite. Now, given that matter only has a finite number of ways it could assemble itself given the laws of physics, it is only logical that the following is most likely true. Travel far enough into space, beyond our observable universe, talking a gazillion parsecs of cosmic distance, and don't be surprised to find another Earth with another you where physics class is the same, but history class differs a little. Perhaps Nazi Germany won World War II, and everybody speaks an alien language despite being pretty much a clone of everybody on this planet. Travel another unimaginable Googleplex in another cosmic region, and the entire Milky Way analogue is found. There is yet another Earth which, by chance, is exactly the same as our home planet, another you speaking English with internet access on another YouTube, watching this exact same video, or to be precise, an identical video by another version of me, and the entire history of the planet is the same as ours. It is also called Earth. Your limited human intuition might find this counterintuitive, or crazy even, but think again. The implications of our universe being infinite are exactly entailed by the scenario I've just described. If our universe is infinite, that scenario is actually not just mathematically plausible, it is logical. These are the philosophical implications of a vast enough space in existence. In fact, crazy would be to assume our tiny speck of a world is completely original and unique in appearance amidst an infinity. But we don't yet know what's out there beyond our observable universe. The regions of space googolplex parsecs away is only one type of parallel universes predicted by eternal inflation. These can logically exist in the same Euclidean space as our own, alongside the other type which sprouts from the fuzzy roots of reality, in essence, quantum mechanical superposition. These are only two types which are mathematically predicted within our multidimensional reality. We are talking about theoretical physics here, which are mathematically closer to science fact than science fiction, even though someone like Bernardo Kastrup would describe these ideas as grotesque. Nevertheless, these ideas are interesting and expressed in the book Our Mathematical Universe by Max Tegmark. Tegmark strongly argues for a multiverse because it seems to make sense out of observable phenomena. The book certainly doesn't discount the implications of infinity and why it is so hard for simple minds like ours to swallow. I never really understood the theoretical physics that predict eternal inflation until I picked up the book. Our reality often turns out to be stranger than what we intuitively think. Just the simple fact that less than a cubic centimetre of matter was enough to devastate Hiroshima should blow our minds. At the heart of it all, Tegmark suspects that mathematics itself is the ultimate nature of reality from which physical structures and minds are derived, although I believe he is mistaken in this presupposition, as it makes more sense to say that it is mind that breathes fire into the equations, so to speak. It might not be coincidental that Tegmark's subsequent project after publishing his book was to explore the phenomenon of consciousness. But two things should be clear. Nothingness can't possibly have an existential manifestation, therefore something, and Platonic objects, as metaphysical as they sound, cannot be easily dismissed. There are mathematical truths which are independent of physical objects, but they do require the illumination of consciousness in order to be said to be true. They still have to be mentally apprehended. Needless to say, materialism falls apart when, out of logical necessity, things must begin as non-material before becoming material. So, our best description is waves of probability and energies on the positive and negative sides of the spectrum that appear to make up the cosmos, which, funnily enough, according to the latest in cosmology, add up to zero. The entire universe, according to the likes of Lawrence Krauss, can be described as an imbalanced nothingness currently balancing itself out. Weird. The flatness of the universe in all directions happens in the inflationary sense, and not to be mistaken with the flat substrate in holographic theory. The space-time fabric appears to be three-dimensionally stretched to the point of suggesting infinity, which leaves us to face the crazy implications I've mentioned previously with my example of an infinity-derived quirk, such as multiple Earth analogues, with many versions of you within our Euclidean space. I'd like to illustrate what would happen if a cosmonaut from here managed to reach a remote region of space, perhaps using a wormhole, only to discover a replica of Earth with the exact same history. The cosmonaut's simple mind might be so awestruck and puzzled that he might deem such discovery as too much coincidence, and that something strange, perhaps of a divine nature, is at play. How can a hyper-remote region of space mirror our own in space and time at such magnitudes? But such magnitudes are pretty much insignificant in the infinitely grand scheme of things. It would only be the cosmonaut's naturally limited mind that would assign a grandiose significance to what would be, in actuality, a logically random cosmic event. A great significance could be assigned, however, to a scenario where our planet is absolutely unique in the entire universe, despite the laws of physics that ostensibly limit what it can do. This scenario would certainly be beyond weird. There is another theory which talks about our universe containing multiple universes. Black holes, for example, could still, in theory, hold universes inside them. According to the holographic theory, our world is the gossamer reflection of an information-rich hypersurface that makes up a surrounding cosmic frontier. Postulations here appear to be reinforced by the fact that the quantum realm is fuzzy. Some say that, according to Tononi's integrated information theory of consciousness, black holes should be conscious due to hyperintegration beyond the human brain. Physicists have been smashing particles with surprising results that at first appeared to be magical. Imagine orchestrating the collision of two subatomic particles at high speed only to beget a third, which is heavier than its quantum progenitors. This is analogous to the crash of two Ferraris producing a ship as large as the Titanic. It's really strange. But then we take into account not just the mass of the initial objects, but also the speed, the momentum, the force of impact, etc. And it all adds up to the surprising result. This happens, of course, against our intuitions. And this takes us right back to cosmic inflation and a question that I think Alan Guth figuratively asked, which was, who paid for the ultimate free lunch? We know that 1 gram of inflating matter turns into 2 grams of inflating matter, paradoxically doubling, and yet no laws of physics are broken. In other words, mass appears to be created from nothing. Einstein provided a loophole here with special relativity where, famously, E equals mc squared. E is energy, m is mass, and c is just under 300 million meters per second, or the speed of light. Now here's a clincher. The speed of light is such a large number that, and that's why a tiny amount of mass corresponds to a huge amount of energy. Here's an example. Less than a kilogram of mass released the energy of the Hiroshima nuclear blast. What does all this mean? You can increase the mass of something by adding energy to it. Here's another example. A rubber band can be made slightly heavier by stretching it. Applying energy to stretch it means the energy goes into the rubber band and increases its mass. So the rubber band has negative pressure because you need to work to expand it. For a substance with positive pressure, like air, it's the other way around. You need to do work to compress it. In summary, the inflating substance has to have negative pressure in order to obey the laws of physics, and this negative pressure has to be so huge that the energy required to expand it to twice its volume is exactly enough to double its mass. Puzzlingly, one might point out, inflation causes accelerated expansion. So how do we unpack this? Gravity is undoubtedly an attractive force. So if we have expanding stuff, shouldn't gravity decelerate it? Einstein saves the day with general relativity theory, which says that gravity is caused not only by mass, but also by pressure. Since mass can't be negative, the gravity from mass is always attractive. But positive pressure also causes attractive gravity, which means that negative pressure causes repulsive gravity. An inflating substance has huge negative pressure. Guth calculated that the repulsive gravitational force caused by its negative pressure is 3 times stronger than the attractive gravitational force caused by its mass. So the gravity of an inflating substance will blow it apart. I know it is a lot to digest, but let me finish this by saying that the inflating substance produces an anti-gravity force that blows it apart, and the energy that this anti-gravity force expends to expand the substance creates enough new mass for the substance to retain constant density. This process is self-sustaining, and the inflating substance keeps doubling its size over and over again. In this way, inflation creates everything we can observe with our telescopes from almost nothing. This is what prompted Guth to refer to our universe as the ultimate free lunch. Inflation predicts that its total energy is very close to zero. And then we realized that the same mechanism that produced our universe could very well have produced many. In fact, to assume it only produced one seems absurd. Here's an analogy for this. Our universe is a mini, and as we forensically examine the vehicle's properties, we come to realize that a car factory produced it, and as we theorize about the factory's properties and functions, we begin to conceive with our mathematical minds an infinite cornucopia of distinct vehicles that this Hilbert space factory must surely be still churning out, for there is no scientific reason why it should stop. Here's another mind-blowing analogy from Techmark. Imagine a shoal of fish in a tank who think water is immutable space that pervades all existence and couldn't be any other way because it's fundamental. And then there is an Einstein fish who figures out this watery space represents one phase in a possibility of three, such as ice, liquid, and gas. Analogously, we live in a universe where most humans believe space itself couldn't be any other way. However, the most intelligent of us figured out that our laws of physics are not fundamental, that there are only locally effective, and that space itself can in fact exist in a number of phases that far exceed the Googleplex. And the realm of mathematics, which describes every structure in existence, can outdo human imagination and has probably served as a template to create worlds well beyond what is depicted in Rick and Morty, which brings to mind the trillions of dimensions encased in the amplituhedron and the possibility of other Hoffmannian headsets beyond what we are currently aware. I'm going to stir this philosophical monologue towards the practice of lucid dreaming as a means to explore, in the least, one portion of the nature of reality. Dream worlds are light and colourful, implying a photonic makeup potentially manipulated by a conscious will. Maxwell discovered that light is an electromagnetic wave in the 19th century. Measuring 2 points in a beam of light uncovers a strange oscillation whose frequency ostensibly determines light colour, and its strength, which can be ascertained by voltage, correlates with light intensity. We label these electromagnetic waves depending on their frequency. If increased, they become radio waves, microwaves, infrared, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, etc. But at the end of the day, they are all forms of light made up of nothing but photons, just as on a subatomic level, there is no difference between wood and metal save for the way in which atoms are arranged and our perceptual discriminations. Physicists have concluded that it is all energy in the end, and we are all entangled to a single wave function, which is what we call universe. To predict how all this energy is going to behave in the future, Erwin Schrödinger came up with an equation. The trouble is that this formula doesn't exactly predict what particles will do, and reveals that the microscopic does not obey the classical laws of physics, which is weird because Newtonian theory seems to work pretty well up until this point. It's like a dream which we believe to be physically real, and uncertainty comes to the fore when we attempt to predict which route this massive wave function will take. Suddenly, we are presented with a sea of probabilities whereby single events ostensibly collapse to matter for us observers. If there is some truth to the Copenhagen's notion of wave function collapse, and assuming consciousness as a fundamental plays a role in steering the space-time fabric, however slightly, one might question the purpose of a collective consciousness selecting for catastrophic events. What I'm about to say next could provide food for thought. We could answer this with another question by the same token. If dreams are largely generated by our subconscious minds, why do we have nightmares? If you haven't seen the film Repression, watch it, because it is a philosophical horror mindfuck invoking Schrodinger's cat, the concept of quantum minds, determinism versus free will, the idea that the universe exists inside someone's brain and we don't really exist because we are part of this higher person's dream/nightmare, and our cosmic dreamer lives in a much larger universe which might also be another's dream. Here is a lucid dream I had a few years ago which made me ponder about a universe existing in my head. A universe invaded by its inadvertent creator who, with godlike powers, decided to terrorize its inhabitants on a whim. It was on the 23rd of March 2013. I'd gone to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning and awoke at 5 to use the loo. I returned to bed a few minutes later and managed to have a lucid dream that I came to call Psychokinetic Butcher. Back in bed, and this is directly from my journal. So back in bed, I decided to try to induce a wake-initiated lucid dream using the technique of trying to separate from my sleeping body. Relaxing on my back, a lapse of consciousness seems to have occurred before I came to fully lucid in a strange house. The place is a shambles, like a family has just moved in. A ladder leads to a dark loft that arouses my curiosity. I gravitate towards the square opening on the ceiling in order to explore it. I rub my hands together and think of how cool it would be if my bedroom was in that loft. Suddenly, the dark and empty loft turns into a bedroom with curtain-covered windows seeping crepuscular light. The cuspidal ceiling above me adumbrates the roof, and, astonishingly, a massive bed supports me and practically covers the entire floor. I feel excited about the manifestation of an ideal bed large enough to roll around on it many times over. As I bounce on the mattress, I remember something from waking life. Recently, a few houses in my area have been broken into. It occurs to me that the lucid dream state might be used for andragogical purposes, such as rehearsing appropriate action in the event of a burglary. So, in this lucid dream room, I expect the house to be burgled at any moment as I approach a balcony. For a bedroom in the loft, the ground outside is incongruously high, and I catch two adolescent boys jumping up and attempting to grab hold of the balcony bars. They are suddenly men, and I am so keen to face them that I end up instinctively using telekinesis to levitate them into the bedroom, and, in its dark ambience, I mutilate their bodies with a blunt knife. One is killed instantly, and the other is disabled with severe injuries. Then, while I pin the injured one on the ground, I gouge out the dead man's left eye and keep pulling on a red thread of flesh until his cerebrovascular innards come through the skeletal socket. The severely injured accomplice screams in horror, so I take the pleasure to stuff his mouth with his dead friend's guts. I am exhilarated with power, even though gutting the burglars in such a surreal way isn't exactly what I had in mind in rehearsing how to deal with a break-in. After all, telekinesis cannot be used in real life to overpower interlopers. Although their entrails are quite lifelike, they are not structurally realistic. I suppose my mind could have concocted something close enough to the real thing from years of being exposed to a great deal of human anatomy pictures, And even if I hadn't been exposed to that kind of material in my life, I suspect my mind would have created something convincing from imagination. My hands are covered in blood, and I wonder if I have experienced the same elation as some psychotic killers do, or something similar. When I look up and out through the balcony railing, I discover an old man sitting in a restaurant across the road, staring disapprovingly at me from behind a pane of glass. He raises a hand and telekinetically causes a lamppost to break away from the concrete pavement just outside the restaurant. Then a swift gesture on his part sets the object in motion towards me. I gesticulate in an attempt to mitigate the old man's control over the airborne lamppost, and the object ends up crashing in the middle of the road. This had not been foreseen. Something impossible has happened in this lucid dream which requires me to use unconventional means to deal with it. Using telekinesis, I force the old man to smash through the window, and all it takes is a gesture to make him ascend through the air and splat on the pavement below. In the real world, it goes without saying that I would not be able to deal with a witness to my crime in such a way. Indeed, my actions in this lucid dream have already defeated the purpose of learning to realistically handle a mundane situation such as a break-in. What sparked my behaviour might have been the temptation that comes with finding oneself in a scenario of absolute power. Indeed, I feel drunk with power, and the old wizard has proved to be no ordinary witness. The course of events gives me a profound sense of elation that eggs me on to unleash my powers in a destructive way. I am the apex of this dream world, the master endowed with consummate power, and I want to express that. I begin to gesture with my hands, and supernatural winds sweep people off the streets. Even a bus gets caught up in my magical gust, and it goes flying to crash afar. And here I stand on this balcony, summoning and playing with the wind like a homicidal god until I wake up at dawn. As you can see, lucid dreams can realistically depict entire worlds and elaborate illusions of devastation. But in hindsight, one wonders about inner universes populated by sentient characters and that might make up the personality of the dreamer. And then one is forced to speculate about the waking world too, and its dynamics within a universal mind in the context of idealism. The nature of reality is inextricably tied to consciousness, because this one is needed in order for anything to be confirmed in existence. Without consciousness, things might as well not exist. If the light of consciousness is required, then this simple fact is telling us that it is the ground of being. It's fundamental. 2023 was the year I began to take idealism seriously after the Nobel Prize in Physics had been awarded the previous year. That same year, in the aftermath of the Nobel Prize, Christoph Koch lost a 25-year-old bet to David Chalmers because his testing of Tononi's theory of integrated information did not solve the hard problem of consciousness, and the neural correlates weren't exactly what was predicted. A few months later, a scientific conference about consciousness saw distinguished experts scratching their heads and no consensus. The data from experiments testing the global neuronal workspace theory also wasn't what was expected. I soon came across Donald Hoffman pointing out some curious results from the Large Hadron Collider, and not long after that, I discovered the work of Bernardo Kastrup germane to analytical idealism. Federico Fagin's theory of consciousness followed after that, reinforcing the notion that consciousness is fundamental and not a byproduct of brain activity. Physicists dealing with high energies were puzzled by the fact that it took endless pages of algebraic equations just to describe a single trajectory of new particles from nucleic collisions. The mathematics was too complex. That is, until someone suggested treating space-time as just another feature of reality rather than a fundamental fabric. As soon as they did that, the mathematics became way simpler, no longer than a single sheet of paper to describe a single subatomic trajectory. Moreover, it revealed new geometries like the amplituhedron that have to exist prior to space and time. What's more striking is that these mathematical constructs, whose decorated permutations are the roots, as it were, leading to the Planck scale and Markovian dynamics, symmetrically map onto features in our quantum field, such as spin, mass, momentum, etc. During my research, I also came across the Wigner-Neumann collaboration. Eugene Wigner thought that the ultimate observer is consciousness, not the detectors which are made of the same fuzzy quanta that is measured by them. Wigner eventually stopped talking about it because he feared his colleagues would think of him as some kind of weird solipsist, which is insane because idealism is not solipsism. I eventually confronted the philosophy behind conscious realism and the fact that materialism violates Occam's razor, whereas idealism doesn't. If you would like to see how, check out my video entitled Why Idealism Should Be the Default Position. Consciousness has to be fundamental because it is irreducible, formless, immaterial, but certainly not nothing. And it is capable of containing entire worlds as it adopts forms through mentations, giving rise to qualia and concepts. Ontological idealism was first presented in Indian philosophy over 3 millennia ago, but it encountered major opposition with Western Enlightenment. This opposition, however, failed to refute idealist metaphysics, often coming up with straw men or simply deciding that such a philosophical view is too counterintuitive. You are already familiar with the argumentum ad lapidem, or the appeal to the stone fallacy. If you can't remember my previous video, let me refresh your memory. The name comes from an 18th century debate between Bishop George Berkeley and writer Samuel Johnson. Berkeley argued for immaterialism, where the world is essentially made of the perceptions of conscious observers, making the universe ultimately ideal. That's what subjective idealism was called back then. Johnson, on the other hand, found the claim that matter doesn't really exist quite ludicrous, and upon seeing a large stone, kicks it with enough force to rebound from it before making the following declaration about his opponent's theory: I refute it thus. With this act, Johnson hoped to ridicule the implication in Berkeley's worldview that a stone could be immaterial. Even lawyer James Boswell at the time, who witnessed their interaction, recognized that immaterialism, though apparently absurd, was unfalsifiable. We also have to remember that people at the time were under the impression that Newtonian physics was the be-all and end-all. Turns out, Johnson had not refuted subjective idealism at all. He failed to grasp that solidity is also a percept in mind. He failed to see the truth that Berkeley was pointing to. All we have is our minds. If we kick a large stone in a dream and our foot rebounds from it, do we then conclude that it's absurd to think of the object as immaterial? This question can be extended to modern naysayers of idealism who dare its adherents to jump in front of an oncoming train. When I step in front of a train in a dream, I wake up. If I were to do that in waking life, I would most likely get crushed by the train and die, and presumably sever my disassociation from the mind at large, perhaps awakening, as it were, to unbounded, expanded consciousness. But in answer to materialist naysayers who challenge idealists with such a fatal dare. I am not going to do that because I don't want to upset my loved ones, as they would have to spend the rest of their lives without me. I don't want to wake up from this gross shared dream just yet. We will all eventually transcend this disassociated human perspective, and when it happens, we will acquire a broader focus, more scope, and a far better vantage point. You may ask why it should be so. Well, if consciousness expands upon death, perspective becomes less restricted. For instance, you drive to Paris for the first time and quickly realize that you don't know your way around. But with GPS, you can go anywhere. The satellite navigation system is more capable than you, driving alone without it. The satellite is analogous to the mind at large, with far more information and beyond your human ken and purview. Bernardo Kastrup's idea of a mind at large is synonymous with Carl Jung's collective unconscious, unconscious only from the perspective of localized consciousness. Doesn't a collective imply more than just a unilateral part, or indeed an individual? After all, Gestalt theory states that the whole is greater than its parts. The source of all reality is consciousness, and can experience itself with more clarity and metacognition than a normal human perspective could, because from a viewpoint divorced from conceptual constructs, it can become aware of itself. It is in its nature to potentially know everything. It is both one and a collective. So when we die, we become more, not less. This is consistent with near-death experiences or NDE reports. Joining a light, feeling loved, feeling like one is back home, knowing all about the nature of reality only to find it hard to recall it later or put it into words, the epiphany or revelation they experienced, and being told to go back to the human form against their wishes to remain there forever. Millions of years is nothing to the mind at large because it transcends both space and time. I've had some experiences before which were quite profound. One was when I was using a type of mindfulness meditation exercise to achieve a wake-initiated lucid dream, but instead something unexpected happened. I stumbled upon a pristine cognition and it was blissful, and I felt very much at home. The other was at university when I passed out from too much marijuana and alcohol. It's like I had a little NDE where I felt like I was on a fluffy cloud, which was extremely comfortable. Next thing I know, I am floating over the heads of talking people at the unibar before I come to in the gents, with someone slapping me and trying desperately to bring me to consciousness. I felt uncomfortable and annoyed at his desperation when I had been just fine. Another profound experience was when I had an out-of-body experience at home and went to a vibrant and colourful place with cottages, a winding river, well-groomed trees and rainbows. There were flutes and birds chirping with beautiful harmonies, and I felt like the place was made of love. I felt so nostalgic too, for some reason. But a being that looked like a cross between an angel and an alien didn't allow me to stay there. I was sad when I woke up. Previously, I recounted my experiences with psychedelics. At my university prom, I took magic mushrooms and tripped for about 9 hours. I saw wonderful things, patterns, angels in the sky, statues winking at me, people's faces resembling the clouds of planet Jupiter. I felt taller with a buzzing aura around my head, and at one point, 2 things happened. I saw a bird descending from a tree to pick up a twig from the ground, and I found it beautiful and deeply meaningful. Then I became euphoric with a strange epiphany. As I looked at the trees, which resembled giant broccoli, I felt like I had created absolutely everything for my own amusement, and I was laughing at the worldly circus that surrounded me. I was still me, but felt godly, like my consciousness had expanded, and I felt like I was remembering some truth about reality. Then the moment passed, and I continued tripping, but I remember thinking, what the hell was that? I felt like I was more than just being me. That seemed magical. And I can only imagine what happens when we shuffle off our mortal coil. In the documentary Rethinking Death, exploring what happens when we die, a doctor recounts what happened on his first day on the job, when he was supposed to be under the supervision of a second-year resident for a 36-hour period. He introduced himself to a patient, and subsequently the patient's eyes rolled up in the back of his head, and he fell back onto the bed, apparently lifeless. The doctor initiates resuscitation and the nurse comes in and asks him to speak to the patient's wife, who had just showed up, and reassures the doctor that she will shock the patient if he rearrests. The doctor went and spoke to the wife in very pessimistic terms about her husband's condition. Around 11:30 a.m. the patient's lunch showed up, and the doctor, who hadn't had breakfast nor lunch by then, decided to eat the patient's food. Finally, sometime in the afternoon, the patient stabilized and his pulse returned, but needed to remain in hospital for about a month. On the last day, the doctor walked into the patient's room, and the patient asked him to shut the door behind him before telling him about something that had been bothering him. He proceeds to tell the doctor that he had an out-of-body experience during his arrest and had observed everything the doctor had done during the resuscitation procedure in minute detail. In his out-of-body state, he also followed the doctor down the hallway to his discussion with his wife, and even told the doctor he could have been more optimistic with her, and that, as if their discussion wasn't bad enough, he observed the doctor eating his lunch. Even more striking was when the patient told the doctor he thought it was unusual that, even though he was dying in front of him at the time, the doctor was feeling sorry for himself because the second-year resident had left him alone and wasn't supervising him as promised. The doctor hadn't told a soul about that embarrassing thought, and yet the patient knew about it. It seems that the patient was able to read the doctor's thoughts during his near-death experience. So it seems like our perceptual powers increase once something causes us to transcend our cerebral barriers that appear to shrink our experience and define the limited anthropic perspective. I'm not saying that we immediately acquire a godlike view of reality upon death, but it is certainly an ultimate possibility as our consciousness expands. The Vedic concepts of Brahman and Atman might convey the holarchic relationship between part and whole. They are one and the same. In Hermetic idealism, the all is both one and many. So, in my opinion, even from the perspective of a universal consciousness, Solipsism doesn't apply. It might be one medium of mind, but multiple perspectives nullify the concept. We must remember that both physicalism and idealism take on board the theory of mind in order to avoid the problem of solipsism. Solipsism is just an unfalsifiable proposition. Of course, we will always wonder if the entire world and people are just figments of our imagination. After all, we can only be 100% certain of our own minds. But we can overcome solipsism by finding it empirically unlikely. There are many indications that we share a world with multiple sentient beings. Also, if it is possible for our own personal minds to exist, then it is plausible that other minds also exist apart from our own. Solipsism is a word that is usually applicable as a hypothesis in the context of a human being as a dissociated locus of consciousness. It brings up the question of
Am I, as a human being, the only mind that exists? Meaning, in an idealist context, the only disassociated conscious perspective. Solipsism doesn't refer to a mind at large, of which we are all a part, because right now we are not perceiving from the perspective of some kind of expanded cosmic consciousness. Every conscious observer is real, and if there are many, then solipsism is false. For solipsism to be true, other ostensible observers apart from the true witness would have to be mere semblances of sentience in one's imagination. And even from the perspective of a mind at large, solipsism doesn't become true all of a sudden, because, as I pointed out before, the all is one and many. We would have to erase the many parts of the equation for solipsism to have any reality. There would be no we. It might help to think of the all as a holarchic hive mind. The multiple conscious observers make up a swarm of bees, so to speak, which work together as one. But obviously, our idealist metaphysics entails a gestalt far more profound than what is captured by my beehive mind analogy. I have also made a distinction between consciousness and its contents before, where the latter can be illusory but not the former. Consciousness itself cannot be an illusion, because it makes no sense to say that we are not conscious, that we only seem like we are. Consciousness cannot be reduced to a mere illusion, because illusions require consciousness in order to exist. An illusion is something which isn't what it seems. In order for this to work, a conscious observer is required to be mistaken about what he or she is observing. The definition of illusion is not applicable to consciousness, otherwise it would render this one non-existent, and we know this to not be true. Consciousness undoubtedly exists. The contents of consciousness, on the other hand, are illusions. The world of forms that we observe gives impressions of solidity and of being outside our minds, but such a world is always mentally apprehended, thus being a mental construct. I tend to heed Adi Shankara's clay pot analogy. If clay is analogous to consciousness, the clumps, pots and plates that we can make out of it are the worldly forms which we tend to name. These forms come and go as the clay is in perpetual flux, and Shankara thought of them as unreal, nothing but mental constructs and conceptions. But Shankara gets our attention to the fact that the clay remains the same in its makeup, despite the changes from clump to pot to plate, etc. The clay is eternal and unchanging in its nature. Shankara classes it as the only real thing, the only medium which is mind. There was only ever clay, despite the changes. There was only ever consciousness. Your field of awareness is the eternal witness. Mind implies minding something, the contents of consciousness. The contents are illusions because their appearance is just a mentation in consciousness. Ultimately, there is only consciousness, the ground of existence. Consciousness, as I've said before, is formless and doesn't rely on anything else to exist. It can identify with perceived forms and concepts, but its essence is nothing but an eternal witness. It's not nothing because nothing by definition does not exist. We know consciousness exists and is immaterial, so it has to be fundamental to all reality. If we are to have an explanation for the physical universe, we must start with something non-physical in order to have any sort of explanation. For how else can we explain the physical, whatever we mean by it, if we don't start from the opposite? We can't explain something by starting with the very thing we are trying to explain. But when it comes to consciousness, we do, because it is the ground of being. Trying to explain the mind by starting with unconscious elements doesn't work and is beyond counterintuitive. Therefore, consciousness, with its irreducible quality, has to be ultimate. Finally, I'd like to talk about the God noun as potentially applicable to universal consciousness. I tend to see the word God, like every other word, as indicating a particular concept, something that humans tend to think about in the context of experiencing a conceptual reality. God, as I see it, is a human concept. I refrain from using the word to describe anything, especially when people can mean different things by the word God. But I am a metaphysical idealist because evidence shows physicalism to not only be untenable, it is less parsimonious than the idea that there is only mind as a medium of reality. Consciousness, to me, is logically fundamental. Without it, nothing can be said to exist. It is irreducible, immaterial, and an eternal witness. It is one and many because it is one phenomenon that can manifest as multiple perspectives. It is the ultimate reality and it is in all of us. We are it. If you wish to say that, given its attributes, consciousness is God, then atheism is well and truly dead. The concept of God doesn't need to have all the nuances proclaimed by religion. The reason why I pointed out that some people might see consciousness as God in the context of philosophical idealism is that 1. Consciousness is fundamental, a kind of prime mover or creator of worlds and conceptual reality. 2. Consciousness is the only thing we can be sure of, as we are unmistakably aware in a world of qualia. Some might say, there is only consciousness, there is only God. 3. Consciousness, as the next logically existent level up from nothingness, which cannot exist by definition, is irreducible, indestructible, formless, and eternal, attributes which are very godlike. We know consciousness exists and its irreducibility is striking, so it has to be the ultimate reality. This doesn't violate any laws and is not a supernatural claim. One is, however, appealing to magical thinking when asserting that unconscious elements somehow generate consciousness. Finally, consciousness makes up the core of every conscious observer. It is one and many, which is redolent of Vedic notions of Atman and Brahman. The myriad drops make up an infinite ocean of experience. In the end, there is only water. There is only the medium of mind. Consciousness is all-knowing, meaning it has the potential to know everything, even itself, as in metacognition or awareness of awareness. It is the ground of experience and being, and always knowing something, like the contents of consciousness or whatever happens in one's field of awareness. This is similar to people ascribing omniscience to God. Now, having said what I said, unless one is prepared to see consciousness as God, one can be an idealist and an atheist at the same time. Idealism and atheism are not mutually exclusive. There have been many assumptions made about memory too, and not just in the field of neuroscience. Just because you don't remember something, it doesn't mean that you didn't experience anything at the time or that you were totally unconscious. Because you are consciousness, your awareness stream never ceases and you can never truly be unconscious. This brings to mind those of us who claim they don't dream or hardly ever. Of course they dream. They dream every night. They just don't remember their dreams. It comes down to focus and forgetfulness whilst having a brain. I would also like to say that, as much as I admire Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism, I don't see eye to eye with him on the incapability of the mind at large to be cognizant of itself. If the knotty structure, that is the brain, in the medium of mind is sundered, experiential restrictions cease and one is free from locality. In theory, in my view, once consciousness expands, it is also free to be aware of itself. This is metacognition, which is always available to itself, even through anthropic introspection. If you buy into the filtration theory of the brain, then metacognition does not require self-reflective loops in cerebral complexity. The image of integration isn't required for unrestricted mind to be aware of itself. It is mind. It's what it does. It minds all, including its own minding. It might seem intuitive to adopt Kastrup's position that self-reflective loops are required for metacognition, and once one factors in Darwinian evolution. But we should remember that human beings and the rest of the sentient creatures in the animal kingdom are but finite expressions of universal consciousness, which is unitary, unbounded, and includes all. It might seem that we possess more powers of introspection than, say, dogs, but all species are spatio-temporally constricted, and one can argue that human beings are impaired to a higher degree, often slowed down by our own thoughts and convoluted minds that most of us seldom stop to introspect or even appeal to our full potential to contemplate that celestial stillness, as it were, behind the storms. We are often slaves to rumination and the monkey mind restlessly playing and fretting. The human brain as an image reflects a dissociated alter of the mind at large, a finite being trying to hold too much in the confined space of its own personal mind, causing it to inevitably become unconscious, to weigh much more than it can apprehend. Dog owners often report that their pets seem to sense things that are clearly beyond human purview, not just to do with olfaction, and owners often know best and become aware of things to do with their pets even before scientists make such discoveries, such as canine micro-expressions that mimic those of the owners. Once the vibrations that make up our body cease, there may be an ego dissolution, but metacognition should remain as an open potential where awareness can become aware of itself, and in doing so becomes aware of all its vibrations or everything that exists, even if this perspective is totally non-local. This is congruous with the interconnectivity of the entire cosmos. I've been reading The Kabbalion recently, and Hermetic idealism has more explanatory power and isn't restricted by academic thinking that often needs to be unlearned. The infinite creates finite dissociations and forgets itself through them. But these dissociated beings still know, deep down, the unrestricted potential of pure consciousness. In the case of human beings, it often needs to be unlocked, or the individual can stumble upon a holistic epiphany. I really recommend that people check out the Hermetic Order of 21st Century Idealists. On YouTube, check out the channel Hermetic Idealism by my man Stephen Wallard. I'd like to say one final thing in criticism of what I take to be the desperate dregs of materialism. I recently came across an article on the Advanced Science News website entitled Materialism Matters, The Role of Philosophy in Science, which was authored by the computational chemist Kieran Schlegel-O'Brien and published on the 20th of February of this year. I'm sure Schlegel-O'Brien knows a lot about his field, having obtained his PhD from the University of Manchester, but his science can only inform him about how the pixels of reality behave, as it were, not what they are in and of themselves. I've explained this before. And if he knew anything about idealism, he would recognize that nothing about his philosophy requires a new science. It is regrettable that I found his article poorly written, as it fails to understand what metaphysical idealism entails. It actually strawmans idealism by claiming it denies the world's existence and that it contradicts the cosmic evolutionary period prior to the emergence of life, which it doesn't, as we understand universal consciousness generating potentials and begetting the laws of nature. The article also expresses a misplaced fear about science somehow being unable to progress without materialist metaphysics, whilst ignoring the quantum eraser experiments of John Wheeler, the Wigner-Neumann theory that consciousness, and not the detectors made of the same fuzzy quanta, is the ultimate observer, and the violation of Bell's inequalities, which prove that reality isn't locally real. There are no hidden variables, for which a Nobel Prize was bestowed recently. It's not that new physicists and evolutionary biologists and neuroscientists, are blindly adopting prevalent beliefs in their milieus which agree with idealism, as the article claims. It's science itself that, since Newtonian physics, has been slowly eroding the physicalist paradigm with new discoveries. The article clearly betrays, apart from ignorance, how ironically religious and dogmatic some materialists can be, to the point of holding on to a worldview for fear that not doing so might be bad for scientific progress, which is ludicrous, because I thought that the goal of scientific inquiry was first and foremost to uncover the truth, however uncomfortable or counterintuitive it might be. That was one of the worst articles I've ever read, and I don't think the likes of Kastrup or Hoffman should even deign to retaliate until this Duffnut does his homework on philosophical idealism. What we see in Schlegel O'Brien's article is near enough analogous to what happened between George Berkeley and Samuel Johnson almost 300 years ago, when the latter thought he had refuted immaterialism without realizing that his approach would only give rise to a well-known fallacy, argumentum ad lapidem, appeal to the stone. We've covered this before. Schlegel O'Brien, like many in his position, is not a philosopher, but he would do well to get acquainted with that which he feels compelled to counter. The same advice goes to other materialists like him. Do your homework. Actually attempt to steel man what you oppose and thoroughly critique it before demonstrating why it's untenable. If you have a solution to the hard problem of consciousness under physicalism, I'm all ears. If you also have a philosophical solution to the paradox of death, because there is a paradox there, then lay it out. At the moment, from where I'm standing, experience has to be continuous. Consciousness has to be a ceaseless stream, because, ontologically speaking, we can never be in unconsciousness, as it's not what we are. It's illogical to assume that we will be thrust into oblivion upon death for all eternity, because we won't be there according to the materialist paradigm itself. What does it mean to say that the lights will go out? To say this implies that what is subsequently experienced is darkness, which makes no sense because, according to materialists, we won't be conscious of anything, not even darkness, in which case there is no room to even be oblivious. There is no room to experience nothing, as nothing itself cannot exist as a thing by definition. Nothing is just an abstraction. So how can we ever be in it? The following quote by Epicurus takes on a new meaning under idealism, where death isn't real when consciousness is an ontological primitive. Where I am, death is not. Where death is, I am not. Thank you very much for listening to my video, and don't forget to like it and to subscribe to my channel.